The profession of accounting has long been the occupation and the preoccupation of Jews from the beginning of time. In truth, one can say we come by it honestly in the sense that the Torah seems to be preoccupied with constantly counting. Every single one of the books has sections dedicated to numbers and counting, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Indeed, we have an entire book called the Book of Numbers. We read this week in the portion of Behar, V'safarta lecha, we should count 7 cycles of sabbatical years and reach and count a Jubilee year. And this comes on the heels of last week's Torah portion, which we are in the midst of right now, of counting, known as the Omer. That after the Jews left Egypt, they were commanded to count 7 weeks, but a unique way of counting. They count 49 days comprising of weeks and days, which we count every single night, leading up to the festival of Shavuot. So last week we read about counting. In this week's Torah portion, we read again about another nature of counting. Whereas last week we're focused on days and weeks, this week we're focusing on years and decades. What is the meaning of all this counting? King David writes in Psalm 90, he prays to God to teach us, to learn to count our days. We know that our days are numbered, but we should treasure and understand the value of each and every single moment we have. Because you see, every Jubilee is made up of 5 decades. Decades are made up of individual years, and years are made of months, months of weeks, weeks of days. And the Torah is taking us on this journey to teach us how to understand the nature of time and how to treasure our most sacred gift that we have, and that is time itself. The Rabbi once famously said that the world says time is money. I disagree. Time is life itself. And as such, we read in the Torah, how do we connect with this most nebulous, but this most important and ethereal and eternal nature, that we can connect to something that exists only right now, but it is infinite. It can take us into infinity to connect to God's time. You know, there was a famous rabbi who passed away in 1815, one of the early Hasidic masters known as Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Horowitz, later known as the Choza of Lublin. He was the rabbi in Lublin, very famous for his unique and far-reaching powers. After he passed away, his son inherited a few of the meager belongings of his father, one of which was a wall clock that had hung in his father's study. And the story goes that one evening this son, on the way home after his father had passed away, after the Shiva and the burial, he is going back home, and on the way he stops at an inn. Due to inclement weather, he ended up staying there longer than he had planned, and when he received the bill, he did not have a way to pay it. And so the owner of the inn says, "Is there anything else that you can give me?" And he says, "Well, I have a few meager belongings that I just inherited from my saintly father. If there's something here that interests you." And he looks inside and he sees this clock and he says, "I'll take the clock as payment." And so it goes. He gives the clock and he leaves. Many years later, another rabbi is traveling through and happens to stay at this very inn. And in the middle of the night, the innkeeper, a God-fearing but simple Jew, hears a commotion and hears a lot of noise coming from this room. So he goes down and he peeks into the door and he sees this rabbi is dancing and jumping and singing all over the room. And this is going on for hours and hours. The next morning he asks the rabbi, "Tell me, what's going on? Why were you up a whole night dancing?" And the rabbi turns to him and he says, "This clock in my room that I stayed last night, where is this clock from?" And the innkeeper shares the story. He says, some years back, there was another rabbi who was passing through. He did not have a way to pay. He gave me this clock as payment, and he said it was an inheritance from his father. He said, "Describe to me this rabbi." He describes him this. He describes the rabbi, and he says, "I want to tell you something about this clock. I know this clock. You see, This clock was inherited from this Rabbi Hurwitz, the Choz of Lublin. It hung on his wall. Every time I would come to visit this rabbi, I would be struck by the nature of how time functioned in his room. You see, for most people, he explains, time is actually a sad component of our day-to-day life. We hear the clock ticking. We look at our phones, we look at our watches, and we realize the seconds are ticking by, and the ticking of the clock is really a mournful trudge toward the future that tells us that we're never going to get back the seconds, the moments, and the hours and days that have elapsed. But you see, he says, with this rabbi, there was a different type of time. His clock had a joyous tone to it, because in his room, one felt that every moment that the clock moved, we are moving one step closer to the Mashiach. We're moving one step closer to the end of days, to the perfection of the world, to the messianic time of peace and harmony. And so we have two ways to look at time. We can look at our past and say, woe is me, what I didn't accomplish. Or we can look at every moment of time as the possibility of what we still have in front of us. This is what King David is asking. God, teach us the definition, the true definition of time, how to count time. This perhaps is why when we count the Omer, we count days and weeks, because it's the nature of people. Sometimes when we try to recollect what happened, we only remember the big milestones in life. The days, they merge into the weeks. The weeks are submerged into months, and it all dissipates into one cloud of time. And by counting, the Torah wants us to understand that just as God counts every single Jew in the Torah, just as counting is a major preoccupation of the Torah, because God wants us to know that every single individual is important, and by placing them a number, it lifts them up out of the general population and assigns them unique significance. This is how we have to look at time. Every moment, indeed every day, every year, every decade, every jubilee is not just something that comes after the one before it. It's separate, it's unique, and we have to learn how to treasure it. This is perhaps why we have so many commandments regarding counting. We go from counting days and weeks, and now in this week we're counting decades, we're counting jubilee, to teach us that no matter where we are in life, we must never stop counting. We must never stop seizing the moment that we have now, not in a depressing, not in a sad way, but in a confident way, that every moment we have is an opportunity to dance to the future, to bring this world to its beautiful end game, the messianic time for which we are waiting for. Shabbat Shalom.